Do you want to crush your enemies and see them driven before you?
Is your secret that you're always angry?
Then you need to check out the Barbarian class in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Greetings, warriors. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
Today we're taking an in-depth look at the Barbarian class in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. They're the quintessential Savage Warrior.
And today we're going to cover everything you need to know to prepare your Barbarian to take the battlefields by storm in your next campaign. We're going to cover the different races, feats, ability scores, and other archetypes that inform the build of your Barbarian character. But we're also going to look at the different personality traits and backstory ideas that can really help you get into the role-playing of your Barbarian as well.
We're also going to look at some iconic Barbarians from film, books, and also mythology.
With that, let's get rolling.
So why play a Barbarian?
Well, the Barbarian is the ultimate expression of unbridled rage and fury. I think that if you want a class that is great to just relax, blow off some steam, and kick some ass, the Barbarian is your ticket.
Yeah, they really are the rage-filled, angry aggressor, and you can throw them into anything, and they can pretty much handle it.
At the same time, I think the Barbarian is one of the most prolific fantasy tropes. Like the image of the bare-chested warrior taking on hordes of alien-looking monsters on a fantastic landscape is a quintessential image in fantasy culture and lore. And I think it's pretty safe to say that without barbarians like Conan and John Carter of Mars, we would not have the Dungeons & Dragons game as we know it today. Yeah, your number one tactic is apply axe to face. At the same time, I think that the Barbarians class features make you super, super tough, but in so doing, they also make you very prone to reckless behavior.
Yes, I've never played with a Barbarian at the table who didn't like to forget everything that the party was trying to tell them and just run headfirst into battle.
Oftentimes that means that the Barbarian is really, really strong and capable in battle, but they lack a lot of the advanced tools that are sometimes necessary for getting out of a sticky situation.
It's also really fun to play that animalistic, vulgar character that doesn't really care what anybody thinks of them.
At the same time, Barbarians don't have to be two-dimensional like that. Like, your Barbarian could rage with the fury of their ancestors, right? They could be fighting for their homeland for a very righteous and noble cause, or they might be in tune with the elements in nature. I think no matter the way your Barbarian fights or why they fight, your enemies don't want to get you angry. They're not going to like you when you're angry.
So what's the Barbarian's role in the party?
Well, I think that right off the bat, the Barbarian is a combat specialist. And I think that that combines two features of the class. Their capability as a damage dealer, but also their capability to dish it out and take it.
I would say that they're one of the tankiest classes in the game.
They're ridiculously tough.
As a DM, I can tell you that I've thrown some of the baddest things ever at the Barbarian at my table, and he walks away with nothing but a little flesh wound.
Every half-orc Barbarian will take every single hit and still be standing afterwards. It takes an outrageous amount of punishment to bring a Barbarian down. I have seen a Barbarian lifted out of the sky by an ancient red dragon, thrown down onto the ground, landed on top of, had the dragon's breath right in their face and a full attack, and they still survived enough to crit the dragon and behead it on their next turn.
Yeah.
It's outrageous how tough this class can be. Beyond combat, you're kind of in a tough spot with a Barbarian. Because if you're in a situation that doesn't give you a lot to engage with physically, like your Barbarian can be the athlete, the explorer, and they're also the perfect guinea pig to spring the traps when the rogue can't find them. But it's kind of difficult to decide what the social and role-playing angle of your Barbarian is going to be beyond just being angry all the time.
I mean, you can have a lot of fun playing a character who isn't very good at social situations or maybe not the most intelligent. At the same time, you don't want to be completely two-dimensional with that. But there is a lot of fun that can be had to play into the lacking abilities.
Yeah, and I think that the thing to look at is that if we, as we go into our examples of great barbarians from fiction and mythology, many barbarians are also kings, or queens, or leaders, right? There's also the idea of the warrior skald. So I think that looking at the barbarian as just an unbridled fury on the battlefield is a little bit reductive. Barbarians can be so much more. They can be the servants of druids. They can be in tune with nature, and they can be leaders.
Some places pick their leaders based on fear and aggression.
And that's a really good way of looking at it. At the same time, I think that the barbarian is the king of toughness, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they are the absolute best damage dealer out there.
Yeah.
And you might be a little bit disappointed if you are looking for the biggest damage nova, especially if your barbarian's in a party with a paladin or a fighter.
The one thing with the Barbarian is it is quite narrow in its scope. So if you're running a campaign that has a lot of political intrigue or investigation or navigation, the Barbarian may find themselves a little out of place in these settings. So let's talk about some of the amazing Barbarians that can really influence our role-playing for this class.
So the logical place to start is Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah, Conan is pretty much the first thing that pops into your mind when you think of a barbarian, because his title literally gives him that.
And even if you might think that films are cheesy, the influence of Robert E. Howard's original Conan the Barbarian stories on Dungeons and Dragons cannot be understated. As we said earlier, if those stories had not been written, there would probably not be Dungeons and Dragons as we know it today.
Yeah.
Conan is an example of a barbarian that is more than a warrior, especially if you've read the original stories. He's a thief, he's a king, he's a scoundrel. He often, in a lot of ways, has more in common with rogues than anything else. But the adventures that he goes on throughout his entire life and all of the stories are super inspiring.
Well, if you want to discuss the misinterpretation of just Smash, another great example of a barbarian, and one of my favorites, is the Incredible Hulk. But what a lot of people don't put into play here is the fact that the Hulk is also Bruce Banner. And you could play this very much like your barbarian before they rage and after they rage. Maybe when they're not raging, they're actually a very simple and intelligent person. Maybe you don't have the intelligence, but you could play them like a much calmer and nicer person. And then when something makes them angry, they go full barbarian. There is that to play with.
Yeah, and that's very much inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where maybe your barbarian views their rage as a curse, as opposed to a power that they have. Continuing along that lines of Bruce Banner, I can see that really interesting barbarian character that takes the sage background, right, and has a high intelligence score, and then has all this cool off-screen role-playing that they can do, but then in battle, wow, they just come to life in a completely different way. Of course, you can look at the many different Germanic and Hunnic tribes that actually were the ones responsible for sacking Rome, like Arminius and Alaric, who are historical barbarian kings. Barbarian queens like Boudica, who fought against Julius Caesar. There's a great tradition, I think, in these cultures of the women being as terrifying as the men. At the same time, I want to mention Cuchulainn from Irish myth, one of the first instances of a legendary warrior filled with rage, and a character that even when he was mortally wounded, he lashed himself to a rock so he would die standing and facing his enemies. He was so dangerous and so known for his rage that his enemies would not dare approach his corpse until a raven landed on it. And even after that, according to legend, he still managed to cut some people's hands off.
I'm a big fan of Maui from Moana.
Yeah, a great example of perhaps a barbarian druid multi-class, or someone with a really cool iconic magic weapon.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the build options for creating a great barbarian.
Yeah, now a barbarian is not difficult to build. Because most of the class abilities that barbarians get in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons simply improve your already existing talents and traits. In a lot of ways, they're just flat out bonuses that are always on all the time. At the same time, you do have to make a couple key decisions early on. So let's take a look at the ability scores, races, and archetype options, and we're also going to explain how a few of the key class features work for the barbarian.
So let's start with ability scores, and this one is usually pretty obvious unless you want to go really crazy with your barbarian, but most people are going to say strength is going to be your main.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you go through the list of barbarian class features, many of them specifically refer to using strength to make an attack roll or an ability check. So while some people have wanted to make a dexterity-based barbarian work, a lot of the barbarians' class features that enhance their melee combat ability only work when you're attacking using strength or making a strength-based ability check.
Yeah, it doesn't mean you can't do it if that's really what you want to go for, but generally speaking, if you're picking a barbarian, it's because you want to smash things with your strength.
Exactly. At the same time, you're going to want your constitution score to be pretty good as well.
Because you're going to take a lot of hits.
You are going to take a lot of hits, and you're going to need it even with your D12 hit die. Because barbarians get a unique feature that allows them to calculate their AC without armor by using their constitution and dexterity, you may be tempted to have a very high constitution and dexterity score. If you want to be the bare-chested, almost naked barbarian, you're probably going to want to have at least a 16 or a 14 in both of these stats to do the unarmored thing, unless you're okay with your armor class being lower than it would be otherwise.
Beyond that, beyond strength and constitution, I mean, really from there, it's just flavor, I would say. I mean, dexterity seems moderately important for the unarmored feature, but you're not going to be putting a whole bunch into intelligence,
Wisdom
or charisma.
I have seen many people play barbarians that their stats looked like 18 strength, 16 constitution, 14 dexterity, and 8 intelligence, 8 wisdom, and 8 charisma. As we looked at with some of the previous examples and some of the role-playing tips, having a little bit more balance is going to give you a much more fulfilling character, I think, in the end. Whether you do that kind of Bruce Banner-inspired barbarian with an intelligence score, or a barbarian king with a high charisma score, or even a kind of a druidic sage barbarian with a high wisdom score. I think even just having one good mental ability score gives you so much more from a role-playing perspective.
Yeah.
That it's worth doing.
So let's talk about some of the races that are really great for the barbarian.
Well, right off the bat, there's 2 that come to the forefront. The mountain dwarf and the half-orc.
Half-orc, yeah, those are both really tough, really strong classes.
Exactly.
Races.
Yeah, because both of them come with a +2 bonus to your strength. In the case of the dwarf, a +2 bonus to your constitution. In the case of the half-orc, it's only a +1. The half-orc is iconic. I think the half-orc barbarian is pretty much something that every dungeon master has had in one of their campaigns at least once, because many new players just gravitate towards it as that iconic archetype.
I mean, they're big, they're strong, and they have some really cool abilities that make you even harder to kill.
They kind of double down on the barbarian's class features because they get the extra damage on a critical hit. They get the relentless endurance so that when they're reduced to 0, they can make it 1 instead. So they make that trait of barbarians not being killable and kind of crank it up to 11.
Yeah.
They double down on being that intimidating force of rage. And they kind of come from that brutal culture and society already, right? In the case of the dwarf, you get this interesting, like, dwarves, I think, also have the tradition of the battle rager in their culture as well, right? And so dwarves kind of represent this fury of the elements or the earth kind of angle, which is really a lot of fun and gives you some cool but non-standard role-playing options too. What do you think of the human?
There are some feats that could be very handy for the barbarian to take.
There are.
So taking a variant human could help. Plus, you get to choose your stats that you're boosting, and taking an extra proficiency It's not a bad thing.
The tricky thing with the variant human, especially compared to the dwarf and the half-orc, is that the variant human's only getting +1 to 2 stats, whereas in the case of the dwarf, it's getting +2 to 2. So like, I think long term, the half-orc and the dwarf might be a little bit stronger, but out the gate, getting the feat right away is probably pretty sweet for a human. I think you could also consider Dragonborn.
Yeah, that's actually the character in my game that I'm running.
Yeah.
It's a Dragonborn Barbarian.
Really cool character, I think, and just a cool concept of that draconic fury, having the breath weapon giving you an extra option to attack with.
Yeah.
If you're looking at Volo's Guide to Monsters as well, the Goliaths are super cool.
Yeah.
And just being that variant on the mountain folk, people really love them. And the Goliath Barbarian has been this enduring image since they were introduced in 4th edition.
So why don't we talk about some of the proficiencies and class features that the Barbarian has to offer?
So as we mentioned, as your Barbarian, you start off with a D12 hit die.
That's the highest in the game.
It is the highest in the game. For weapons, what do we got?
Do we get all weapons?
We do indeed.
There we go.
Martial
Barbarian.
weapons and simple weapons.
But armor?
Armor, everything but heavy armor.
Yeah.
Right? So incidentally, you can use a shield with your Barbarian, and you can wear medium armor. This does get you all the way up to half plate. So a Barbarian wearing half plate with a dexterity of 14 has an AC of 17 before adding a shield or anything else. That's pretty tanky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you add that shield in, I mean, that's even more tanky. But there is the unarmored option, which you kind of have to weigh out the differences there.
For skills, you can choose 2 between animal handling, athletics, intimidation, nature, perception, and survival.
There's some interesting options in there because depending on how you want to play your Barbarian, a few of those, like the nature and the animal handling, you could be a very, very nature-esque Barbarian, as well as if you want to be intimidating or things like that. There's a lot of really cool options in there to kind of help steer your role play as well.
I think that absolutely you're going to want to pick up athletics.
Yeah.
But you might pick that up from your background and might want to look at your background to diversify your skills. Your background is also where you're going to have to go to get any tool proficiencies because the Barbarian class does not natively give you any.
So why don't we start by talking about everybody's favorite ability that the Barbarian has to offer, and that is the Barbarian Rage.
Oh boy, this has a lot of rules.
It does. It's the most rule-heavy part, but it's also the thing that defines the Barbarian.
The Barbarian Rage is something that is so simple to use in play. The player just says, I rage! But then there's been so many times where I've had to be like to a player, well, just remember X, Y, Z. So what are a few of these little things that we have to remember?
Well, you only have a certain amount of rages that you can use per day, so you don't want to just be in a rage all the time.
Yeah, the number of times you can rage per day is shown on the class table for the Barbarian, and it increases as you level up. There have been many times where I've had a player that has wanted to go into a rage and forgotten that they've run out. Especially at low levels when you only have 2 or 3 rages per day, but you might be in 4 or 5 encounters. The other restriction with rage is that you can't be wearing heavy armor when you're using it. So if you put on plate armor, flat out, you cannot rage, no exceptions.
Yeah, part of the rage is being able to run and jump and stab. The heavy armor can weigh you down.
You need the freedom, flexibility.
Yeah.
So you can enter a rage on your turn as a bonus action. And that gives you a couple key benefits while you're in the rage. On any strength-based attack roll, you get a bonus to your damage rolls.
That's pretty awesome.
Yep.
Makes you hit even harder.
It does. You also gain advantage on strength-based ability checks and saving throws. But this is the big point of confusion because it overlaps with the reckless attack class feature. Being in a rage doesn't actually give you advantage on any of your attacks. So just remember that that's a separate class feature. Rage gives you resistance on all bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage.
Which is pretty good.
It's incredible.
Until magic items and magic weapons and magic in general is introduced, so at low levels, pretty much all the minions are not going to be able to hit you nearly as hard.
Exactly. It just makes the class so resilient against weapon damage, and it really stands up across all levels, because even if you are taking extra spell damage, the melee damage and ranged attacks tend to be the biggest sources of lots of damage coming in at once, and being able to just flat out cut all of that in half is almost like doubling your barbarian's hit points while you're in a rage.
Yeah, so basically when you rage, you hit harder and you get damaged less.
Yep.
That's pretty much the keys right
Great
there.
trade. Remember, your rage lasts for 1 minute, but it ends early if you are knocked unconscious, or you end your turn and you have not attacked an enemy or taken damage since your last turn. The other restriction for any of you that are interested in multiclassing with your barbarian is that you cannot cast spells, nor can you concentrate on spells while you are raging. This severely limits the multiclassing options for barbarians, because any class that is going to rely on spells and spell slots is really not going to overlap with your rage ability. That said, there's some really interesting ways around this. For instance, if you happen to be a barbarian paladin, you can still use your spell slots to smite.
So why don't we talk about another really cool barbarian ability, Reckless Attack.
Yeah, Reckless Attack is pretty straightforward. At the start of your turn, before you make an attack, you can choose to attack recklessly. When you do, you gain advantage on all your attack rolls that turn made using your strength. However, all attacks made against you till your next turn have advantage.
Now, this is kind of a pro and con, but I would say with the barbarian's ability to take so much damage, it really is a good payoff that you can take this, you can
Absolutely
dish out so much damage, and then I mean if you have the ability to half the damage coming at you, it's going to work in your favor.
The synergy with other abilities that barbarians gain is very, very high, especially if you open up the option for feats. And the downside of doing this is not that much of a downside, especially if you're in a barbarian rage. The reason for this is quite simple. As we mentioned earlier, a barbarian with a 14 dexterity wearing half plate has an AC of 17, which is pretty high. And if you've got magical items or anything to improve that even further, you're still pretty hard to hit, even if your enemies do have advantage against you, right? While you're raging, you're also taking half damage from most attacks that are going to be gaining advantage, since there's very few spells that make attack rolls that can really benefit a lot from having that advantage.
If you're taking that
Yeah.
chance, I mean, the chances of you dishing out more damage
Yep.
than you're going to take is just it's worth
Yeah.
it. It's almost always worth it.
And where it really comes into play is like if you take feats like Great Weapon Master, which give you a -5 penalty to your attack roll, the Reckless Attack completely offsets that penalty. And then if you combo that with like anything that gives you a bonus action attack, like Frenzy from the Berserker archetype or the Polar Master feat, you're just raking in the gravy. Like that's really how you dish out a lot of damage as a barbarian, is using Reckless Attack alongside feats like Great Weapon Master and Polar Master.
So we also have Relentless Rage.
This is an awesome high-level ability that barbarians gain. What this means is that if you drop to 0 hit points, but you aren't killed outright, for example, disintegrated, you can make a DC 10 Constitution saving throw, which if you're proficient in Constitution saving throws and have a good Constitution score, will be very easy for you to make. If you succeed this check, you don't die, you don't drop to 0, instead you're left with 1 hit point remaining. This makes you phenomenally tough.
How does this stack up with the half-orc's ability?
So if you are a half-orc, you use this one first, and then use the half-orc one, because the half-orc one automatically succeeds.
So you could technically get reduced to 0 twice in the same battle and get back up.
Exactly. So there is no limit to the number of times in a battle Relentless Rage can trigger. You can continue using it, but the DC goes up by 5 each time. So if you're reduced to 1 hit point and then a bunch of goblins stab you, you're probably going to go down, right?
Yeah.
But it's going to help you avoid that big hit. Then, when you take a short rest or a long rest, the DC resets to 0. So this is something that you can rely on in every combat. It's part of what makes barbarians just so monstrously tough to kill.
Does it reset to 0 or does it reset?
Reset to 10.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So with Primal Might, it's the Barbarian Capstone.
Yeah.
You get +4 to your Strength and Constitution scores.
Jesus.
And this can increase your Strength and Constitution scores beyond 20.
And that's level 20.
Yeah, this is the big Capstone ability.
So, as you can see from the Barbarian, everything pretty much stacks on top of each other to make them ridiculously hard to kill and ridiculously vicious in combat. Let's talk about the Barbarian's Primal Path.
So at level 3, you're going to be able to choose your Barbarian Primal Path or Archetype. And you've got 2 options in the Player's Handbook, and a few more were added in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. So you've got 5 options. You've got the Berserker, the Totem Warrior, the Zealot, the Storm Herald, and the Ancestral Guardian. All of them are pretty cool, and they all build on Barbarian strengths in interesting ways, with the ones in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, I think, diversifying the Barbarian a little bit more.
Well, let's start with what are some of the great features of the Berserker?
So the Berserker, straightforward, very easy to use. And the big one here is the Frenzy ability. It's a big upgrade to your Rage, because while you're frenzied, you can now make an additional attack as a bonus action.
Because they need more attacks and more damage.
Yeah. The trade-off of this, though, is that when your frenzy ends, you gain a level of exhaustion, which is actually really brutal.
Yeah.
And it means that you're going to be limited in the number of times per day you can use this, because very, very quickly, the first use is going to give you disadvantage on your ability checks. So that means that even when you're raging now, you lose that advantage on strength checks that you would otherwise get. And eventually, if you're using this frenzy ability really more than twice, the penalties are gonna really be.
You know what I see frenzy being useful for is basically the combat finisher.
Yeah.
It's like you're close, you're at the final boss, it's bloodied, you're bloodied, you go into a frenzy, you put everything you have into it, hopefully end the battle, and then you can get exhausted.
Yeah. My critique of this, though, is that there's so many other ways as a barbarian to take, if you're using feats, to get an attack out of your bonus action. I actually think the Berserker is pretty weak.
Well, let's talk about the next option, the Totem Warrior.
Okay.
Totem Warrior, I think, is, I mean, if Berserker's the weakest one, this one's one of the strongest, and it's a little ridiculous.
Undoubtedly how strong the Totem Warrior is.
Yeah.
And it's the one by which all others are measured, and I think also it's just way more fun to roleplay.
Yeah.
I played a barbarian called Creed Red Hands, who is a half-orc barbarian.
It's a great name.
Loved collecting trophies from battle. So he had a leather jacket made out of the hide of a dragon. He had skulls of his most prominent enemies that he carried with him. And at one point, he killed a rock, and he sewed the rock feathers onto his leather jacket. So he had one of those cheesy leather jackets with, like, the fringe, except it was rock feathers, and those were his totems.
That's awesome.
Right? It was really, really... I think there was also, like, some bear hide on there.
Yeah.
And, like, I just played up the cheesiness of this character.
What are some of our best totems? There's
the bear totem.
the bear totem.
Like,
is that the one that gives you resistance?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's stupid. In a good way.
As a bear totem barbarian, once every couple levels, you get to choose a totem, which will be like the totem of the bear, the totem of the eagle, the totem of the wolf. And each time you get an option from a few different ones. But you're not required to stick with the same one each time. So if you choose bear at level 3, you don't have to choose bear again at level 7 and level 14. You can choose one of the different options. But the thing is that you can only choose one option from each set of levels. The bear totem, giving you resistance to all damage that isn't psychic, which is overwhelmingly good.
It basically, at that point, you have literally doubled your hit points for pretty
While
much
you're raging.
any encounter while you're raging.
Unless you're fighting mind flayers, in which case you should just run. The flip side of that, the level 14 one, where the eagle rage, where you get to fly.
Why not? Why not be a flying barbarian that can't take damage from anything? Because that sounds fair.
Yeah, it's stupid. It's great. I love it. Like, somehow I think that giving the barbarian the ability to fly as a DM, you just kind of go, oh.
Let's take a look in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, because we want to read a few of these ridiculous things to you.
So the barbarian paths in Xanathar's Guide to Everything are super awesome. The Path of the Zealot has some amazing class features. The first one being, just continuing on our theme of like, how do you kill this barbarian?
You don't.
You don't. At third level, a Zealot Barbarian's soul is marked for endless battle. And if they're targeted by Raise Dead or a similar spell, the material component is unnecessary. So your party cleric can just keep resurrecting you.
Over and over.
Over and over again. They get an ability that lets them reroll failed saving throws. But at level 14, so if you thought the Relentless Rage ability was tough to deal with, at level 14, having 0 hit points doesn't knock a Zealot Barbarian unconscious. They continue to fight until their rage ends.
They still have to make death saving throws.
Yes.
But even if they fail those death saving throws, they still stay alive until the rage ends.
If you would die due to failing death saving throws, you don't die until your rage ends.
How's that for an ability?
And then, if at the end of your rage, you have a bunch of failed death saving throws, but someone heals you at the end of your rage, you live.
Or, I mean, if you do die, then the cleric can just resurrect you again at no cost.
Yep. The other primal paths in Xanathar's Guide to Everything are the Path of the Storm Herald, which really feels like the most elementally attuned of the paths. It gives you kind of more quasi-magical abilities. And the Path of the Ancestral Guardian, which is a really tanky... Like, if you want the archetype that punishes your enemies for not attacking you, the Ancestral Guardian is the way to go, right? And I also really like the role-playing of, like, the rage and fury of your ancestors. It's a great, like, tack to take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the great role-playing opportunities that we have with the Barbarian.
Yeah, what kind of backgrounds would we start off with choosing for a Barbarian?
Oh, that's a good one. There's a few good backgrounds, and really, I mean, you could play a lot of weird barbarian backstories here.
Yeah, or a lot of quintessential ones. Like, if your barbarian has the sailor background, you know what that says to me?
A pirate?
No, a Viking.
Viking.
I'm thinking a Path of the Zealot sailor barbarian devoted to Thor, who is waiting for the death he deserves. So that's why he keeps coming back. Maybe you are a criminal. Maybe you're a Thieves Guild enforcer, right? There's always the muscle, right?
Well, I remember in, it wasn't Skyrim, I think it was the previous Elder Scrolls. In one of the Elder Scrolls game, when you join the Assassin's Guild, there's one of them is a big orc wearing armor, and he's like, yeah, they hire me to do assassinations. Everybody loves stealth. I just walk in and bury an axe in their face.
Exactly, right? So, sometimes the best solution, as we said, is apply axe to face. They're, like, especially with, like, the noble barbarian, right? You could be just from a complete warrior culture.
Well, yeah, that, like, when we think of noble, we think of, like, the fancy clothes, high scale, but, I mean, depends on the noble of where. You might be, like, we talked about the barbarian lord, the barbarian king. That's a noble.
Yeah, and you're trained in persuasion and history because you know your ancestors. So again, like, if you're a noble barbarian, Path of the Ancestral Guardian, right? You are heir to a line of kings, and your rage, actually, maybe that is the manifestation of your royal bloodline. Yeah.
What are some of the questions that we want to ask ourselves when we're creating our barbarian?
Why are you so angry?
Why are you so angry, man? Yeah, no, it's that is the main question. Is barbarians have this rage? Is it just when they see battle, their eyes turn red, or is it something deeper?
Yeah, and like maybe your barbarian is just an angry drunkard enforcer type person that is just totally greedy, and I think that quality of greed is another common thing across many barbarians. Lust is really common amongst them. But also a drive for conquest and power, right? So, a barbarian might see themselves as a future conqueror, and their ambition is to rule. right?
I also just like the idea, and I know this one's a little cliche, but you mentioned it earlier, the barbarian who's just maybe at the end of their life and looking for the glorious death. And it's like, oh, the world's being threatened? I'll go fight whatever's threatening it. I'll hopefully die in battle killing it as well, and that will be the most glorious end I could ever imagine.
The biggest difficulty I think that many DMs can have outside of the combat issues with barbarians is that often they're very one-dimensional in terms of role-playing, and they just want to intimidate people, they want to be angry all the time, and I have seen it time and time again where like the party is trying to solve a mystery or interrogate a prisoner, and the barbarian player gets really angry and just decides to snap the neck of the prisoner, or you know, they're mad because the action isn't happening now. And I think that it's worthwhile as a player of a barbarian really thinking about how you're going to roleplay your barbarian in between the combat scenes, right? Because the game isn't always fighting monsters. And if you're going to be bored like making a tower of dice because your barbarian is just getting impatient, well, either roleplay that and say like, my barbarian gets antsy, they don't like being in this room, and then just characterize that in a cool way. Or find a way to work against that by playing an intelligent barbarian, by playing a leader, by playing somebody that has a more spiritual focus, but then gets to be like night and day when they get into battle.
So this has been our guide to the Barbarian class in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We hope that it inspires you to channel your rage in the right direction.
After all, what's better than a little bit of creative destruction? And of course, we want to hear about all your tales of conquest and glory on the battlefield. Tell us about your barbarians or any ideas that you might have for building barbarian characters in the comments below.
And barbarians are people of action, so if you want to learn more about the actions in combat, check out our video on that right over here.
We also mentioned the polearm master feat earlier in this video, so if you'd like to learn about that damage dealing combination, check out our video right over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.